Welcome to the final episode of Political Perspectives before Election Day. I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner, and I'm joined today by Jim Antle, Executive Editor of the magazine, perhaps appropriately at the end of a campaign which has been pretty unedifying. We want to talk about garbage, which is all in the news. The first thing, Jim, is let's look at what started it off, which was a joke at the Madison Square Garden rally that President Trump held in New York last weekend.
There's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico. Okay. All right. Okay. We're getting there. Again, normally I don't follow the national anthem, everybody.
So, Jim, it was a pretty unfunny joke. The response was pretty muted. It was tasteless. And immediately it was jumped on by Democrats as being racist about Puerto Ricans. Was that a fair characterization of the joke itself?
Well, it was certainly a stupid joke. It really didn't have any place in a political rally.
Right.
And, it's one of those things where maybe the media exaggerated its significance, but think of what the potential upside of even having a guy like that there is versus what the downside is. If you're making jokes about large voting blocks and voting blocks that are well represented in battleground states, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense. He was guilty certainly of stupidity and tastelessness and possibly of the racism which he was accused of, although I think that's more debatable. But the aftermath has been extraordinary. This was seen as, in part, confirmation of the comparisons that the left had wanted to make between the rally and a rally there in 1939 by Nazi supporters. And then, rather extraordinarily, on Tuesday evening, President Joe Biden was on a Zoom call with a left-wing Latino group, and he described Trump supporters as garbage. Let's listen to that.
The Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable, and it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done.
The Democrats spent 3 days building up the idea that it was absolutely outrageous to classify this group of voters, the Puerto Ricans, as garbage, if that's indeed what the comedian did. But there, very explicitly, President Joe Biden called Trump supporters garbage, which was Hillary Clinton, when she used the phrase deplorables, was only talking about a portion of Trump supporters who were deplorable. Right. This was all of them. This was an extraordinarily crass and dumb thing to say at this point in the election, or at any point, really.
Absolutely. Now, they've tried to attach an apostrophe to this and sort of revise what he said retroactively, but it was a very dumb thing to say. It also stepped on a news cycle that had been favorable to them since the Madison Square Garden rally, so it really undermines those Democratic attacks on the stand-up comic because obviously the sitting president of the United States is more important than a comedian relatively few people have heard of. And it happens on the same night that Kamala Harris is trying to give her so-called closing argument. And she's been attempting to distance her campaign from a lot of her supporters who are saying, including Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and now President Biden, that somehow this is really a test for the voters of America and the people supporting Trump, not for Harris as a candidate.
It was another example, and there have been several already, where President Biden has scheduled events that clash with those of Kamala Harris. I mean, why, for example, was he not invited? He was in the White House, and she was on the back lawn giving her speech. Why was he not there? They want to distance themselves from him. So he scheduled, or something was scheduled for him that coincided with it. And as you say, drew attention away from Kamala Harris's Ellipse speech, and perpetuated the whole garbage narrative, but to their disadvantage rather than to hers. So, what would you say about any tension between Biden and Harris? of which this is the latest echo. How should we think about their relationship, and how damaging has she been to him? Sorry, he been to her. She has obviously been damaging to him to the extent that he's no longer the nominee.
Right. Well, I think number one, she is really weighed down by his record, which is their record. But clearly his performance in office as president has contributed to why this is such a difficult environment for her to be running in. But since she's replaced him at the top of the ticket, there's obviously been some tensions between their teams, and there are lingering signs that Biden is not really happy about being displaced. I mean, he's been running for president since 1987. He finally got there. Normally anybody who runs that long is a historical footnote, doesn't ever make it to the White House. He did, and it was taken away from him after the primary process. So there is bound to be some lingering ill will, and there's going to be a debate if she loses about whether that means they should have stuck with Biden or whether Biden should have gotten out a lot sooner.
So let's talk about the Ellipse speech, which is her sort of final message. I think that the idea, to some extent, was to be in approximately the same place as the January 6, 2021 disturbances that were so damaging, I suppose, to the nation and also to Trump's reputation. He did not behave well.
On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list, ruled by chaos and division. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power.
What did you take away from what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it?
Well, I think the really big thing is that Harris is making her closing argument about Trump. And I think she is trying to assemble an anti-Trump coalition more than a pro-Harris coalition. So it reaches all the way from the socialists on the left to Liz Cheney type Republicans, maybe ex-Republicans on the center right. And that's an unwieldy coalition to try to keep together. But this is something that's worked for Democrats more often than it hasn't, dating back to 2018. So they're sort of going back to the well on that. There were some portions of the speech, though, that were a little bit more about trying to reintroduce herself to the American public, which is something that a lot of undecided voters have said that they've wanted, and that Harris has given a little bit of short shrift to, especially in the later period of her campaign. But how much that breaks through with the overall anti-Trump messaging is not that clear.
It's rather extraordinary to be introducing herself as who she is, telling voters, at least to a small extent, what she's going to do with only a week to go before Election Day. But as you say, being the non-Trump candidate has worked to some extent with voters in the past, and so perhaps that's a good bet. We're obviously going to find out very soon, perhaps not as soon as Election Day, because there's going to be more disputes, and I think we can pretty much guarantee there's going to be legal fights thereafter. Right. But Jim, we'll come back here again soon for another edition of Political Perspectives. Please join us again next time.